Okay, welcome back to the Warhorse podcast. Pilot episode 2. We left off with uncertaintism, the mold, breathwork, and we still got quite a few little crumbs and kernels to pick up before we can move on. At the end of this podcast tonight, I'm going to leave you with a couple of tools, tricks, techniques that I have discovered or developed that I hope are going to bridge the gap between the esoteric kind of aspect of this and the practical, physical, and applicable side of it. And I believe it'll be pretty valuable. I think they taken together will start to give you an experiential base from which to start exploring your baselines and developing your own unique view on this. I'm going to start out with some stuff on this black and white thinking idea and PTSD. And in my experience with PTSD and learning about it and the like, what I learned along the way was that you have a trauma loop, which I think we mentioned, but probably didn't go into great detail last time. So the trauma loop starts when you're very young. It might very well be a natural, I don't think that God sets us up for failure. I think that we live in a distorted, contorted, perverted state of affairs. And a real quick side note, if you're not familiar with John Taylor Gatto, I would make yourself familiar with him. There's some podcasts and videos that a website called tragedyandhope.com put together with John 5 or 6 years ago that do him, they do a good job in terms of talking about the conspiracy related to the educational system, certainly in America, which is, that's most of my experience. That's most what I'm going to refer to most of the time. And we mentioned those 10,000 hours of being seated in a chair. In his book, The Underground History of Education, Mr. Gatto, who has passed away at this time, goes into great detail and makes the conclusive, just irrefutable case that this was a conspiracy, that the idea was absolutely, Animal Farm, to make us into cattle. And that's essentially, what we are from the standpoint of the elites. The technocratic nightmare that I think is in full swing right now arises out of this, the designs of these same people. We'll plenty of time to go into that. I hope to have the proprietor of that website, Richard Andrew Grove, on at some point. I learned a lot from Mr. Grove. I think he's got a lot to teach. So I won't go into great detail now, but I bring it up to relate to the existence of the trauma loop, and apparently, supposedly, or probably, it starts when you're a child. It starts with something small, innocuous. Maybe your mom gets mad because you bite her while you're breastfeeding, and this triggers you. And it's a very, very tiny, almost imperceptible blip on the radar, but it's enough to start forming a neural pathway. Over time, more and more upsets. Certainly in modernity, separation from the family is, I think it was Mr. Gatta who said, has an idea more obscene or absurd in all of human history ever taken root than the idea that it would be good to take your child and give him to somebody else who you don't know, don't trust, and who probably came from, the lowest IQ brackets. No offense if you are currently working in public school or you know somebody, but I'm sorry, most of those people are dumber than dirt, and that's usually where they're pulled from. But that was his point. Your whole life is spent providing for your children, and in one way or another, those are the values I espouse and live my life by. That's how my parents looked at it. And then but the irony didn't hit them. I went to public school and they did as well. But you're just going to hand this over to just some person who happened to land the job. What do you think is going to happen? Well, they revert to this Prussian schooling that was refined and refined again, and then the history of the microprocessor and technology, caught up. We have this reference in episode 8 or 7 of season 3 in Twin Peaks, where the fabric of reality is ripped open and some external creature entity is inserted through. Radio, television, the chip, the internet, the iPhone, social media, all follows. And where is that fabric now? Michael Hoffman, for those that are interested and haven't realized or had this connection pointed out, Michael Hoffman and David Lynch are in total agreement, as far as I can tell, on the whole history of the Trinity site. And we won't go into it too deeply. Michael Hoffman would be a great guy to have on. I should try and do that. I'll try and remind myself, but you guys can remind me as well. Anyway, a couple of tangents there. Back to the point. This dissociative loop, this neural pathway, the trauma loop, would have you, again, whether it's natural or it's definitely exacerbated, but how natural it is, we have no way of knowing. And at present, the thinking is that we are all in a state, along some spectrum of PTSD. So you listening to this right now might have had a pretty good life. I had a pretty good life up until a certain point when I no longer had a good life. There was struggle along the way, but I definitely wasn't scrapping in the streets for my dinner. But worse shit than that can happen. And if you're in that situation, I would be careful in examining your own life, because taken from a strictly factual point of view, if even just the underground history of education is perfectly true and you have been subjected to it, then you have a fully developed mold holding you in, holding you back. And that's the interface through which you're engaging reality. Now, I don't know, in terms of the mold, if it can finally and ultimately be beaten. This question philosophical of, pure freedom. I'm not so sure that it really does exist. We have this teleological, there's a narrative of our lives, and it's leading to something. There is meaning, and that meaning, from my point of view, only arrives or is only revealed, when you confront death. So we hopefully, there's this paradox of, so maybe that's the final battle, if life is the training ground for death. However, the black pills and despair, this is no-go territory. The Orthodox say that, there's a few unforgivable sins, suicide, etc. But despair is unique because it's completely unnatural. It's not the actual state of things, and you start to, in a state of despair, you're actually working against whatever ray of hope is there. And again, referring forward to these exercises that I'll give you, it's there. The question is whether or not you can gain enough control of yourself to find it. Groping around for the light switch in the dark, only maybe you've been shot, maybe people you love have been killed, maybe you're going to die, but you still need to go ahead and grasp around and find that fucking light switch before, you switch off. Because I think we all like to imagine, I certainly do, an end where I'm surrounded by my loved ones and things are fairly, peaceful and comfortable. Got a drink of water. I got plenty of time to gird my loins to face that portal. The truth of it, of course, is much, much different. It can arrive any day. Today could be the day, tomorrow, etc. It's very tough to both, engage fully in life and keep this realization at the forefront, maybe not quite, but certainly on an accessible burner, so to speak. So back to our PTSD and dissociative state. If we break this word down a little bit, if we take a child who's dissociating at a young age, essentially what that means is the emotional and reasoning centers are not communicating. If we look at ourselves as adults, particularly, and I think I'm speaking mostly to men, don't worry, we're not going to get a whole flood of, Iron John get together and bang drums in the wilderness sort of shit. What I am going to give you is an admonishment to take a really hard look at what is probably a minor or major case of Dunning-Kruger with regard to the relationship between your emotional and reasoning centers. this suggestion I made last time to, build out a capacity to think in black and white, it has a place. And that place is probably not as you hopefully gently go about reacquainting yourself with yourself. Physical, of course, because this is where this trauma is located. And over time, as I keep saying, like, this is a long-term strategy. And the goal here is longevity. Without time to process these things, or without time just to drink as deeply as possible of the stunning beauty that surrounds you, maybe the love of your family, maybe to come through on some of the promises that you've made, the things that you need to make sure happen. You're going to need time. And in order to buy time, you are going to need to ensure your health. So, this situation where we have this second brain in our guts, real briefly, if you don't know kind of how this works, is, and I don't claim to know it all, but in a sort of rudimentary sense, if your gut biota is all out of whack, you're essentially dealing with unnecessary inflammatory response. That inflammation, seemingly, maybe by genetics, maybe by other factors, routine, predilections, etc., can sort of locate itself in this place or that place, or one system might suffer before another. But as you find, if you hang out, with kind of the circle surrounding Brian McKenzie or the HHP Foundation, breath work in general, all of these systems are related. And you only seemingly have direct access to the one. You can massage lymph, you can eat kimchi to work on your gut flora, but the only one that you can take with you while you're driving, walking from your car to whatever you're going to engage in, is your breath. And it seems to be, the Holy Spirit spirates. And there seems to be, if not a direct lesson, at least an insinuation or a pointing of the finger towards this this ability that we have to take charge of at least one system, which hopefully, if you have the time, it will. You can. I have done it. Many, many others have done it. You can start to rest back, control, and equilibrium. Granted, you'll need to do some other stuff depending on how far gone you are, or what your goals are in terms of performance. Remind me, you guys in the comments, we can add some addendums. I'm not a naturopath, but I recommend it. That's all I recommend. I do not, if you're still turning to mainstream medicine at this point, I would just turn this podcast off and go beat your head against the wall. But you're probably not, and that's great. So there's other stuff you can do. However, the breath, at least what I'm advocating for ultimately is an intimate, constant relationship. Sort of like that relationship that church folk are hoping to achieve, this relationship with God. This mystified me for most of my life until it finally clicked. So there again, there's some relationship between your breath, your attention, your self-awareness, which are all in cahoots together. One is feeding the other. There's some connection there. And clearly I'm recommending that you build this relationship through constant effort, and the rewards are plenty. Just in terms of this longevity thing, building out this sensitivity or building out this self-awareness, you're aware of aspects of yourself, right, is going to ultimately allow for observation of all sorts of patterns that you might not be aware of. To say nothing of, it's going to be a foundation for, just stuff you would get in bro science or, bro jogging, as Jay Dyer likes to say, sort of self-improvement stuff. Well, that's fine. This was a comment I wanted to make. There's a number of threads that run on the internet now. One is bro jogging, and another one is kind of like the John Vervaeke, Jordan Peterson, constant theoretical dissection and just intense, permanent trepidation towards, taking a position on the material, the immaterial, the interface, etc. That's not what I'm about. I really appreciate those guys, and I do listen to some of those podcasts. I do gain from them. I value them. However, that's not my road. Those guys are kind of having that conversation, and I will check in on it. But I know where I'm going. I think even Vervaeke might have a breath practice, and fuck, what do I know? I mean, he might be way deep into all sorts of other stuff. I'm judging him purely on his output, which I can only guess what his reasons are for presenting himself the way he does, which is totally honorable and fine. It's just not what I'm doing. I feel like a little bit more urgent. I think maybe these guys have had slightly more sheltered lives than I have. But that was just a little side note that I had been rolling through my mind the past few days. And in terms of PTSD, hopefully we're starting to build a little picture here where you have a set of habits that are, at one point may have served you, and then they probably didn't, and maybe they're still hanging around. You have a set of habits that you probably didn't choose, that were in response to an oppressive situation, of one varying degrees, and your coping mechanisms provided to you by your family and your upbringing, again, are on some spectrum. And to use the addiction metaphor again, there is a moment where you have to find this, you have to expose yourself to the potential that you might be more fucked up than you thought. I don't know how deep this rabbit hole goes, but I do know that in Orthodoxy, we refer to ourselves, we each do, as the greatest of sinners. And I have told my friends about very personal moment that will be lacking here without the context, but I don't, to sum it up, to say prior to this moment that happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I don't ever remember feeling actual humility in 41 or so years of life until that particular moment. And I was lucky enough to have enough self-awareness, reflect and realize that it's like, wow, that's what humility means. And this is the first time that it's ever fucking dawned on me. We also have this concept called metanoia, and the change of heart. And for me, those two are related. And anyone who's listening to this, you don't have to be orthodox. You do it, whatever. You can take it purely from bro science or, internet podcast guy. If you can open up enough space to observe what's happening and then seek to refine it, I think you're on the road, basically. And going briefly, right back to this systems and inflammation situation. It's not clear yet, to me anyway, why we would retain trauma, some type of energy or a counterbalance against something within our structures, within our architecture. Our muscles eventually will contort our bones. In any event, this inflammatory response, the brain is not protected from that. It's directly, instantly related to this gut serotonin circuit. All of your organs are feeding back with this inflammation. And your immune system is this explosion of autoimmune disorders. Where does that come from? And obesity. Like, we have a few ideas. There's a few pretty clear culprits on the obesity thing. But how's it go that far? How's this autoimmune stuff, lurk and then start to seep out, and then boom, you've got, an invalid or somebody whose life as they knew it is gone. Talk about new normal. I mean, I've known some people very, pretty close to me and heard these tales of one day things were okay and then they weren't. And this is, for me, the tie back to longevity and where your values and beliefs, how much fuel can you pull out of those into your discipline to actually build physical, consistent disciplines. I don't know. I'm looking to find out. That's one of the, again, the meanings that exist for me in life, what remains of it. So, the mold, uncertaintism, PTSD, breath work. The breath, again, is your main tool, potentially your only tool. I mentioned this in the Patreon post, if you've gone on with, this inflammation, your PTSD loops or your trauma loops running rampant, or with very little suppression, or maybe you're still just pretty young and they haven't caught up with you yet, then that's great. But at some point, these the cost will be paid, and the sooner you can face up to that and get a grip on it, the better. What the breath does, what I'm trying to get to here is, if your trauma loop, your mold has carried on for years, and you can just observe that there are signs that suffering is starting, age and disability or disease, whatever, are starting to catch up. What this may indicate is that is this phenomenon where the alarms, the alerts that your body is sending off have gone unheeded for so long that I guess it's almost like your body is communicating to you, like, all right, asshole, I've been screaming at you for a long time through one mechanism or another, whether it's whatever, gas pain or your teeth, your gums bleeding or foot fungus or something. Maybe just, seemingly not a big deal, but you're not listening, so I'm gonna have to have a crisis here. Evidently, this is what's going on, because studies have shown that people whose stress is rising and rising and leading to a panic attack or an acute sort of anxiety episode, which is, again, not exactly what's going to happen in a fight or flight scenario, but very, very closely related. And if it's gone on this long, the studies are showing that it all kind of goes ignored. And it's not really the case that you're cruising through life and everything's going great, and then all of a sudden you just have a meltdown. That's not how it works. And in my experience, that's just undeniably the case. It's true. So I mention that, as a bit of a cautionary thing, because, well, you don't know what you don't know. To summon the dead Don Rumsfeld just for a moment, and then we'll let him pass off. But you don't know, and so what do you have to go on? Well, the tale that I'm weaving here for you is hopefully suggesting to you, and your own observations looking out at the world will hopefully suggest to you that this shit ain't right. This is not normal, natural, healthy, going well, in most, if not all, major senses. So, what the breath can do for you, however, is, so let's say you are not experiencing a panic attack right now. I'm not a psychiatrist, so nor am I a doctor, so the ultimate caveat should go out that all this is, my experience, and if you choose to experiment with it, I wish you well. I think you'll do just fine. But it's an uncertain thing. We're in uncertain times. The people that we turn to, the authorities, are clearly bought and paid for and unreliable, and in a lot of cases, outright malevolent. So, turning to a breath practice for me, as I've said before, was life-saving. And if we assume that you are cruising along and you're having some of these alarms, like most people probably are, the inflammatory response is pretty ubiquitous. The diet that most of us grew up with, that's pushed on television, movies, etc., is poison. And most of what we imbibe, taken through our eyes and ears, is also one form of poison or another. All this stuff, accumulates. So let's try and transition to some specific description of what a breath practice looks like. And what I'm going to try and say is, you're probably in a state of, you're on the spectrum of, not that spectrum, but the spectrum of PTSD, trauma. You have a loop and you're probably not aware of it. And again, it's not a big thing that you need to dredge up your inner child about, but you have an opportunity to face it through the physical. And that seems to be kind of a gift, because it strikes me that if we had to go back, and what would we even do, to parse out these memories, whatever began one guy's trauma loop or another, what would one of us do in terms of revisiting, say an event that happened in our adult lives? What if some of those scars are never going to heal? Well, God seems to have given us this access to the physical. And as you breathe, your mind calms. Just like that. Emphasis on the exhale is always a helpful thing to remember. You can use this to grow your awareness simply by sort of the exclusion of all this other shit in your mind. The monkey mind is a dumb term that I don't like to use, but we will here. It's your to-do list. It's the things that are nagging at you, subconscious and otherwise. If you can use the breath as an access point to start observing your thoughts, you can start to let go of probably 98% of those thoughts because they're trash. In opening up that space, you open up this two-way valve or however we want to look at it, where those ideas, plans, solutions, etc., insights, revelations can bubble up and through. There's now room for them to exist too. Maybe this is, God communicating to you, and that seems to me to be what it is, and that seems to be, I hope I'm imparting a very high degree of gravity when we talk about this, because you and I are not going to go out in the desert and sacrifice a goat and, make up some fucking mantras and have it mean anything. It ain't going to happen. That ship sailed. It was destroyed. a good reference point for this of recent time, E. Michael Jones, the deliberate destruction of our many, many, many cultures. The million cultures, microcultures that were supposed to have flourished in America were homogenized so that they could more easily be crushed and controlled. So, yeah, that's part of why I've gone back farther than that in my religious and mystical pursuits. But at the same time, we have these new strains, these new techniques and tools that are available to us. And yet they're ancient, right? You're not going to exist without your breath. So I had hoped, and I will do some form of exegesis, related to King of Dogs along the way. Maybe one big long one. Maybe it'll just come out in dribs and drabs. But there's this moment at the end of the book where Grayson is having this conversation, and about the alarm, about you have some inbuilt ability to just turn all this on a dime. Now you're saying, yeah, but you keep saying this takes time. It does, to get good. And it takes time to rebuild enough sensitivity, awareness, and your own just familiarity with this inner landscape to where you can operate with it, especially, until you can rely on it, because that's the goal, to apply pressure. Mackenzie talks about this a lot. This whole thing is about stress and building resiliency to it. But also, it's this paradoxical aspect to reality, the Zen, the reed that bends and does not break is stronger than the one that breaks in the current. This is the way, that was the way then, it's the logos, and it's the same thing. So we're not going into the major exegesis right now, but I wanted to touch on that idea that you do have the ability to simply, whether or not you can tap it, I don't know. I have been able to at certain times, and others not so much. But you might need to do that, to just say, okay, this ends tonight, and my breath practice and this pursuit starts tomorrow, because time is limited. And it is going to take time. Kind of one of those need money to make money things. It's sort of like you need time to buy time. So back to this kind of blow by blow, breath by breath description of how I think this goes is always exhale through the nose, right? Oxygen Advantage, pretty decent book, but the main takeaway is when you exhale, a little bit of that gas is retained in your sinuses, and it transmogrifies, not exactly, but it is altered into nitric oxide, which then on the inhale is sucked down into your lungs and is a crucial component in getting the O2 deep into your lungs. So breathing through your nose, we can go into this, more detail later. There's some nuance to it, when you can breathe through your mouth, when you should, etc. But as much as possible, when you start, just forget about your mouth. Lock the tongue on the roof of the mouth. Relax the neck. The the lungs are a bellows. It's not, the lungs have no muscle. It's entirely the diaphragm, the intercostals, the core that is sucking that down. And one thing I can tell you from experience is from postural issues, you will feel the rush of the inhale, at different places in your throat and the upper esophagus. What you might shoot for in the long term is an awareness of this spot, maybe, I don't know, depending on how tall you are, 4 to 6 inches from the base of your spine up, so your low rib area. A sort of, if you imagine a direct line between that and your sinuses, you're not necessarily pulling air in right at the front of your nose. I suggest you eliminate those drag points eventually. So that's going to come over many, many, many sessions of, I recommend starting out laying on your back and going through some type of muscular relaxation, a semi sort of meditative calming routine. There's many of them in apps. You can do the one where you start with your toes and clench them and release them and kind of mentally walk through or rise up through all the muscles till you get to your head, go back down. Waterfall, which I detail in the Patreon essay, is another really good one to kind of just go, just to begin the relaxation. From there, again, when you're first starting out, you want to pull in so the side ribs, the low side ribs are expanding. I think most people's tendency is to expand the front of the body out. You're much better off to expand into the back of the body. And the construction of the lungs is such that, you have these lobes. You can Google pictures and it might be kind of surprising that it's not just one giant bag. When you see people out and about who have kind of shallow breathing and you have a mental picture of these lobes, you can tell. I mean, some people breathe through like one in the low left side and one in the upper right side, or just in the uppers. They're not breathing. And if they're not breathing, what are they doing? They've given way to the mold. They've given way to death. And they're not fighters. I wish they were. I hope they can pull it together. But you can. And the next step, is probably to monitor or be aware of, you got to kind of be careful of your language. The self-talk, as the other side likes to say, there's something to that, because I think it's probably, again, part of the mold, probably a way that you talk to yourself. It's a routine. It's a thing that's easily broken or easily transferred for something better, which is kind of the root of this whole spiel. Is there's all sorts of stuff that you can just trash, that you can just give up, cut loose, and go right back to the source, and save yourself a lot of pain and suffering, and hopefully provide a lot more value for the people that you love and care about. So you're in observance. There's you're tending, you are attending to the breath, how it feels on the inhale, where the drags are, how the bellows is working. Yoga does, especially at the outset, I think the next kind of pilot episode will have to be devoted to some more practical stuff regarding yoga. and some cultural stuff about yoga. But what yoga will ultimately teach you is that, one, if it's really hard, there's no other way to get through it than to constantly attend to the breath. So it's kind of a harsh way to yoke. I think that's what yoga means, is to yoke, is yoking yourself to the breath. And that's what you want to do. Religion is this, what is it, religare? It's to tie back. These are not happenstances, these words. And that's kind of what you're shooting for, is to tie you want to get to a point where you step out of your car and you're looking around the parking lot as you go to whatever your appointment is. And all of those calculations, forward and back, are being made, but the conscious part of your mind is, even when it slips away for a second, to think about the future, to think about a potential threat, to think about some shit you got to do later, it's constantly tied right back to this awareness, this tending of this thing that you have. This is what it means to have a relationship with the breath. It's kind of like if you're a husband, that's your wife. You can choose to look at other women in the gym. I mean, unless you're going to do something about it, why? Like, why put yourself through that? You're already yoked in almost every way, and hopefully that is meaningful. And that's one of those little benefits that, again, I'm a broken record, but if you're already yoked to the breath, the passions, as we call them in Orthodoxy, these physical urges and psychological urges towards envy and anger and whatnot, if you're not tending to those, if you don't have time for that because you're already yoked to this never-ending relationship with your breath, I guess it does end at some point. And then this is the question, what then? A different kind of breath? Is that what the Holy Spirit is? I don't know. But if you are yoked to this thing, which again may take 3 weeks, as they say, to build this new habit, great, do that, then deepen it, and then develop it, build out a world there. Understand what in that trauma loop wants to come up when you're tired, when you're run down, when you slip. Observe it. As you do, again, the exegesis of the book, as if you're on a trestle bridge and you're watching cars pass below. You can guess about what's in those cars. You can fantasize about stories. I don't believe it matters. I don't believe that you have access to the, quote, inner child. I think that's all horse shit. I think you have access to this one moment that everything collapses into, and I think that's good. I think it was made that way. And to return to the practical, if you're on your back, breathing, expanding into the back and low ribs, you can... Ultimately, you do want to play. You want to try it on your side. You want to try it on your stomach. Pull air into down to your balls, as the right-wing bodybuilders say. That they're wrong. It's not really. It doesn't really work like that. But maybe energetically it does. I don't know. But try all these things. I've referred to this second axis that, again, if Carlos Castaneda stole everything, I could steal everything from him. There's this, assemblage point, I think he calls it, between your shoulders. upper back, right at the top of the thoracic. That is a very sticky area for most of us. We have the slump forward, we have the lombardosis in the low spine, which then sort of places all this constant tension in the thoracic. Particularly, if you do a lot of lower body stuff, that might be an obvious area to look at. If you look in the mirror and you have this big swoop in your low back, check out your upper back, because it might be that the low back is actually strong and supple, but all that tension, all that fear, all that self-doubt, all that shit that you have to bury to function in a world that demands that you function in a way that you probably don't even want to function. There's the price is being paid in multiple levels. So anyway, check that. The assemblage point that he's referring to, I have found that you can bounce the expansion of your breath from that lowest point to a slightly higher and more forward point into the assemblage point, and you can get this giant, super satisfying breath. If you can have a session, lying, seated, what have you, walking, and you can get 6 or 7 of those 2 axes breaths, you will notice you feel better, more energy. Might be the first thing that you notice. And referring back to these systems real quick, if any of this is striking you as ridiculous or whatever, or you feel like, oh, there's other stuff I got to tend to before this, that's perfectly fine. I'm not telling you what to do. If you want to discuss that, you can use the consultation option, and if I can't tell you, which is very possible, I think I can probably point you in the right direction. And I bring that up to say that there are, sorry about that, getting a little wind in the Warhorse. There are supplements like adaptogens, ashwagandha. Those are the few that I know about. But sometimes those can be used to, hold on, I'm going to roll up the window a little bit. There we go. To bring the endocrine down enough that you're going to have access to these sensations of deeper breath. And deep breath isn't necessarily the goal, but I like to take them. It feels like you flush things away, and it might be a process of approach like that. It might be multi-pronged sort of approach, and that's, I think the sign is if you sit down or lay down, or you actually devote some time, quiet, contemplative time to this, and you get nothing out of it, then, and I was in this boat, so don't take it personally, you are probably so locked out from the many dimensions of yourself, whether that's this simple reduction of the emotional is locked out from the reasoning. And by emotional, that's your intuitive. That's oftentimes related very closely to your sensation, your sensatory, the sensations that you're able to feel. If that's the case, then my suggestion would be not to give up, but to take on the multi-pronged approach, because some, adaptogens or something like that, or maybe a change in your diet, or maybe a little more exercise, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks of consistent yoga will be what you need to start loosening this mold up. The mold starts out as jelly. It's going to bend to whatever talents, innate gifts you had in order to cover those. But eventually, its purpose is to calcify and form a cage. Whether this is entirely demonic or it just looks like that is up for debate. I have my opinions, but as I said in that post, accept that however you want to look at it, political, ideological, spiritual, there are forces arrayed against you. And in the Christian sense of things, those forces are arrayed every bit as much as the people that you would likely consider your enemy. And that's not to say that you won't do what you have to do, or I won't, but it is to say, if you're looking at the bigger picture, then it's something to consider. Okay, so a few more kind of practical tidbits. We talked about the nasal breathing a little bit. We'll go into the 2 gears, mouth breathing and stuff later. We talked about this expansion. You'll hear this, breathe into your diaphragm refrain. And that's the only thing that you can breathe into. That's the main muscle that's operating the bellows. The intercostals are there to assist, and it is, this is, talk about a compound movement. If you can find access to some type of, I haven't seen one, but there are some kind of, not so useful, but you got to piece it together where some type of model where you see everything that's involved in one breath and one exhale, and or even that's available to you to use. It's stunning. You're not using them. I wasn't using them. Even after 10 years of yoga, I wasn't using stuff that was available. I don't believe that it was the yoga that made it available. I think it was hearing about these concepts, dismissing them, ultimately finding that I needed them, and then, discovering all kinds of stuff that hadn't been specifically discussed in, the 500 or 800 classes that I took in that time. This does bleed over into a topic that eventually I wanted to weave into this. So I'll jump to that. But first, one last bit on the breath. I have found that as much as it is lateral, the side ribs expanding, it's vertical. And that's that coordination piece. So as you're playing with it, I think like with weightlifting, maybe you work one, you work one set of muscles, you work another. Ultimately, you want to do compound movements to bring them together. A similar sort of thing applies here as you progress. And if you're serious, you will dedicate, it doesn't have to be more than a few minutes or maybe even just a few breaths at a time, but isolate one area and move the breath. You can move the breath to other areas. And you'll hear this in yoga where, like, if the left hip, for example, when I drive, I do like to drive, but I have noticed that my left hip probably from years of driving manual, which I don't really do anymore, will kind of, a few miles in, 10, 15 minutes of driving, I will notice that unconsciously this left hip will kind of become tense as if it's, anticipating. A lot of this stuff seems to be an anticipatory response, which would make sense given the fight or flight basis from which much of this flowers. And, that's just one example where if I pull the breath in vertically with conscious intention, that hip displacement, as minor as it is, nobody would notice it but me. I become aware of it. And I say nobody would notice it but me. Why does that matter? Well, ultimately, what I noticed was that hip, that muscular contraction, would affect the core, which would affect my digestion over time. And, it wasn't particularly catastrophic, but this is the game. It's never ending until we end. You're dealing with the world, your responsibilities, your need to react to it, and this baggage that you carry. And so, simply stated, a big element of understanding, quote, the mold, is to let go of as much stuff that you're carrying around that you don't need. If the boomers had simply, or had merely rather, applied this simplification notion that went around like in the late 90s to the body, to the quote, score that Dr. Vander Kolk proves pretty irrefutably that we're keeping in the body, where would we be now 30 years later? But it's neither here nor there. Okay, so the last little bit I wanted to give you guys today, and then I'll tag on this bit about these various exercises that if anybody else has stumbled across these in this form, let me know. I'd be very surprised. But this last thing, a listener, reader, supportive gentleman brought up, I'd not heard of this. Maskarovka it's apparently a Russian military concept, and just a cursory examination, seemed to suggest all kinds of interesting possibilities related to infrastructure, security, but also social engineering. And I've kicked this around in my way for quite a while, and it's another benefit of all of these practices. It sort of ties, some of this together as well. And the way I want to discuss this is in Portlander terms. I'm from Portland, born and raised, 7th generation. And someday, we definitely got to do an episode about Portland. But you guys know it to the extent that you do. And hopefully you'll give me the benefit of the doubt and let me explain my home, before you condemn this next little segment here. What I want to suggest about Portland in relation to breath work and specifically self-awareness and the mold is this. Gaining self-awareness through a breath practice allows you an awareness not only, should we say, of your true self, but also of your mold. And here we would extend the mold to include all of these limitations, this learned helplessness, the Dunning-Kruger, the cognitive dissonance, the avoidance patterns. Much of this is normalized such that it passes as social currency now. So if you are off at your doomstead and you are collecting, tallow to cook your organic veggies in, and making elderberry syrup, and hand loading, custom precision rounds, like you should be. There's nothing wrong with any of that. I do it myself when I can. But if you're off doing that, you're probably not spending a lot of time in downtown Portland or Brooklyn, or downtown Atlanta for that matter. Maybe you are, but you're facing a sort of different reality and opportunities for this Maskarovka, as I'm, probably erroneously, but I don't think so. I mean, I think that this extends into this area in a general sense, at least. If you're this person and you are faced with the prospect of what I tried to detail in King of Dogs, which is a pre-apocalyptic set of conditions. As we speak, China and Russia are signing various financial and trade and presumably defense alliances. None of this is in the news. It's, presumed that all of this stuff going down now is mostly to mask a kind of inevitable monetary, global financial meltdown, reboot. Makes sense to me. And the spiritual, social, every angle of this circular tube of this water slide of decline that we're all riding now. The turns in that ride are unknown. I took the Soviet perestroika and the epoch or era of decline and collapse right after, where you basically had gangsters, various tribes working to against each other and with each other, and with former generals, or I don't know, maybe they were still on their installed on their bases and selling off tanks to gangsters that were then selling them off to Arab sheiks. But basically, this scavenging hyena phase of the decline. If we're in for that, or something like it, maybe it's just, another thing going on is that you guys are probably aware of, is the whole kind of masking of the supply line weirdness. Is it controlled? Is it purposeful? Is it inevitable? Were the lefties right about some of this? Maybe all the above, I don't know. But where we're going with this is, you might find yourself in any number of scenarios where, and that it might not be the Portlander that you that you need to engage, and you might need to work with them. You might need to gain something from them in a, permissible sort of way. So having some flexibility in presenting yourself, Rolodex of bearings, the military bearing, the studious bearing, the playboy bearing. There's all this, these masks that are available. Stretching thin the mold such that you can, in that action start to reflect on, I don't want to say your true self, but, something close to that, a truer version of the self, a core, is going to, on the one side, you see all this stuff that you can jettison. You don't need to carry a bunch of muscular or whatever form of trauma, tension, breathing patterns, blah, blah, blah. You don't need this stuff. You don't need to restrict yourself to, in a similar way, you don't need to restrict yourself to one form of presentation. In fact, the way of the chameleon or the way of the coyote, whatever we want to say, some type of creature, that's the octopus. That's a good one. I like them. Very curious creatures. The ability to, change your shape, which the octopus has, to change your colors, which the octopus has, as well as, fuck you up and fight and drop an ink cloud and disappear. You'll have all those, probably. But what you may not have is enough familiarity with different social modes, or just enough familiarity with the flexibility of your own being to recognize how much of this is malleable. And back to the broken record, the CIA probably teaches this stuff, but if they teach breath work, I don't know why they suck so bad, because breath work tunes you to the moment, tunes you to these various nuances of yourself, and allows you to let go of that kind of reactionary, habituated form of engagement that we see so often at the wherever you go, the grocery store, the bar, the gym, whoever you entertain. Yes, much of this, or some large part of it, is social nicety and the like. But when you remove this this level of mercantile ethics, as McCarthy says, and you start, having to engage on other terms. Bronze Age pervert, suggests or insinuates the same thing that I am suggesting and insinuating. When you find yourself in circumstances that require you to stretch beyond the way that Dad and Grandpa operated, and the way that maybe, if you were in the military, you operated, because a lot of that is absolutely not applicable. You got no support. That whole mountain of confidence that comes with that is not only removed, but it's displaced against you. And it's not in the same form. So, now, with that said, though, if you were in the military, you probably gained access to a culture that presumably was not the same as the one you grew up in, or the same that you used to woo your first girlfriend, or, make friends once you left the house. It's it's its own place. And so I hope that I'm being clear that breathing isn't just this physical thing. It's not just this healing thing. It really is kind of this access to, if you want to build Batman, I would start here. And I can't remember if we mentioned yet Paul Sharp, who is a guy who definitely has built or is currently building Batman, so to speak. I'd like to have him on the podcast because he is an example of almost what I'm talking about right now, where if you study his Instagram and how he presents himself, and you juxtapose that, the various versions of himself that he allows out into the public space, what you're going to see is a guy with an open mind. Now, I disagree with a few things. Like, I think he has potentially health, or he's made health decisions that led him to veganism, I think. Okay, well, that's not the road that I'm on. I think that the science points elsewhere. But that's not the point. The point is a guy who is a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I think he's a black belt in judo as well. 20 years as a beat cop right around Chicago. An absolute master with all weapons. A member of the ShivWorks collective. Craig Douglas is another guy. Which also, they're kind of in this shared wheelhouse where I don't know the origin entirely, how much Paul Sharp or Craig Douglas, how the origins of what they call MUC, mutual unknown contact, I think, is the acronym MUC, where there's a whole module of teaching that they do. It's available on YouTube, which is absolutely worth every minute of your time. And they've parsed it out to, I think, a pretty damn fine reduction of, and a repeatable approach to managing people who confront you. And the nuance and the uncertainty that's present in those is very instructive. So anyway, Paul Sharp, I think he probably had a hand in developing that. And he evidences an open mind. Not a mind, as they say in grade school, so open that it will fall out. But here's a guy who is by absolutely any standard, I mean, like a modern day samurai, a badass of pretty epic proportions. I know that's saying a lot, but I think it's accurate. And this is also a guy who has cultivated a love of music, a love of food. He's very open about the people that he cares about, his relationships, his ties. He smiles an enormous amount. And I know as well he's had significant trials that he has come through not unscathed, but again, another side that he presents is his sort of self-improvement, or the aphorism side. He is clearly working on this consistently over time to bend his mindset around towards survival. And that's kind of what this is all about. And he is an example of somebody who physically, I think he's rather imposing, but there's no reason to say that he could not insinuate himself into just about any circle in the greater metropolitan Portland area. I would imagine that if you gave him a couple hours or maybe a day to study, some feminist group or some Antifa group, or, we got them all there. We got them all concentrations and all flavors. Aside from the fact that he's, maybe a little bit on the older side to be joining Antifa, I bet that there are not many doors that he could not get through. Some of that probably comes from, I believe he was an undercover cop for a while, which is probably really good training, better than CIA, false mystique stuff. But the point is, one, breath work physically and mentally can form this flexible resiliency that will come in very handy whether you are facing down Cletus, who lives up the road and who gained most of his values and beliefs from a bottle, and his abusive family. I'm not making stereotypes. We can do the same thing. Or, Crystal, or whatever her name is, on the streets of Portland, who likewise also gained most of her worldview from a bottle and an abusive father. It swings both ways. But this flexibility leads to Castaneda's concept, stolen probably from Viktor Frankl, where you have this window between stimulus and response. Castaneda calls it the millimeter of opportunity available to the warrior, which seems actually a much better description. The warrior being this character who maintains a life of absolute sobriety, adheres to an ethic of rigor that would just melt the faces of your average person. There is no average, as man cannot approach the face of God, the average man cannot approach the warrior. He can't even conceive of the type of dedication, intensity that we are talking about in these pilot episodes that hopefully we will continue to expand on in the official episodes, etc. But this is the decisive moment where the warrior seizes the future and decides the outcome. And in a litigious, semi-litigious, vengeful, tribal, fourth generation warfare, all of these rolled up into one sort of scenario, which appears to me to be very likely. I don't think that we're headed towards more stability. We are headed towards more division. And this type of complexity is not going to be navigated by people who have the one proverbial tool. It will not be navigated by the reckless. It will not be navigated by, in equal measure on the flip side, it won't be navigated by the cowardly. It won't be navigated by the person who's still talking to his inner child. It won't be navigated by, and in the middle ground, by those who are addicted, who absolutely receive their, or build their identity out of some just meticulous adherence to a set daily routine in which they're not in control. I'm referring again to the MMA guy who, once the gym closes, or once the context in which this is socially valuable fails, what do you have? Well, you have somebody with one tool. And I think that the one tool guy is not going to last long. And if longevity is our ethic here, amidst the index of possibilities, tactics, techniques that we want to have, you have with breath work a kind of fix-all, if you will, but also the foundation. So let me know if this is all going in a direction that is valuable for you guys. And check out this next little section where I detail a couple of exercises. But once again, if you've made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. And the comments, the feedback has been very supportive. I greatly appreciate that. Along the way, the DMs, the email, these are open. You, please, listeners, readers, part of what I'm trying to do from a personal, selfish place, or, is one, survive, build up a fair revenue stream, something where the exchange is absolutely, we both find it a good deal. And also, as I just briefly touched on in episode 1, find again my way into the world, which writing does that. That's how I did it. But in this vein of multiform and resilient approaches, I hope to develop this as well as a way into the world. And I don't entirely, I don't really want total control over that, but it's part of the goal. So that should swing again both ways. Hopefully the door that I'm opening, opens again in the recursive sense to new places for you guys. So I want to finish up by giving you guys a couple of exercises that you will likely not find anywhere else. I am one who believes in not, remaking the wheel. So on a lot of this stuff, the work is done. Mackenzie, refer to the Patreon post. You'll find some description of places to start. I do think that in one of the next episodes, we're going to downshift the tone a little bit and talk through some of the moment-to-moment exercises, sensations to look for. If you're like me and you spent a lot of years oriented towards the threat, and not oriented like that Portlander towards your next moment of comfort, though again, admittedly, I've done a fair share of that too, my fair share of it. The point being, you might very well, you might not feel any of this shit. So I know that I didn't in many cases. And so having some cues or some areas to look for, to look at, I think will help. And if it doesn't, send some feedback, and we can take it from another angle as well. In addition, towards the end, in this sense of, in this theme, I guess, of an ongoing exegesis, which may be my only shot at one. So I'm gonna go for broke eventually and give away as many of the secrets as I possibly can. Maybe those of you in the future listening to this who have ambitions of writing, I imagine there'll be maybe not something as coherent and accessible as a series just about writing, because I generally think that the weave doesn't quite come together that way. But I do hope to provide, what insights I can, at least comment on what I did and how I got there. But also to use that book to the extent possible as, a teaching tool. So there's this conversation towards the end of the book with Grayson and Ben, the kind of shitheel kid, and it's coming at a point where the kid is starting to realize who he's looking across the table at, and things are starting to maybe not sink in, but reality is scratching the surface for Ben. We might say that his mold is being stretched, probably just from being in proximity to Grayson, but it's being stretched to such an extent that some wisdom or some help can start to percolate through there. And Grayson, it's written as an attempt, because I didn't envision Ben as being entirely capable of grasping. I also didn't envision Grayson as entirely capable of transferring. And Grayson essentially says, you've got this inbuilt alarm system. You've got this thing where if you just reversed it, you have, what he's suggesting in more direct terms is you have, and I think this is God again, building into every tragic instance some ray of hope, or some reality of hope. Grayson is essentially saying that every time that you decide to be weak, or that you have the urge to do this or that, you could just, instead of doing that, take that as an opportunity to not be weak. And ultimately, yeah, it's that simple. I think that in many cases, more is required to decalcify the buildup around that faculty. However, again, for folks listening to this, very likely, this is where you're at. You have an opportunity to observe the moments of weakness, your own avoidance patterns, etc., and then just, no, that's it. Just change it right there. As ugly as it may be. You may have to admit your fault in front of somebody else. You may not. You may have to go farther than that. And I'm not saying to do stupid stuff, but I am saying, stupid stuff in terms of risks or that are unnecessary. The principle here is equally important as the particular. And so one of these exercises or I guess it's an exercise, is, it's sort of related in this, we're taking the mental to a physical place. So if you have access to a sauna, it's super, it's very easy. And I got this idea many years ago when I was talking to this guy. We were talking about he was a very far out sort of dude, and he was talking about taking extreme quantities of, I guess, hallucinogens or various drugs of some sort. And the suggestion was that it was impossible to kind of lose yourself on hallucinogens. And his point was kind of like with people who, if you get drunk, eventually you puke. You may still kill yourself, but you will probably puke. You probably shit yourself, you probably piss your pants, all these sort of things. And his point was like, eventually the body does kind of take over some of these functions to try and bring you back. You've got kidneys probably working overtime to get toxins out of your body, so you're pissing. And, the whole, we'll go into it definitely in this pilot series, the phenomena of the combat shits is related here, which you may be familiar with. But the test basically involves, if you can get yourself to a sauna, but it's not necessary, but you can do it through breath, holding your breath as well. And the idea is, again, the caveats are, if you do stupid stuff with any of the information that I'm telling you, and it's on you. You listen to this, I'm not taking responsibility for it, so don't be stupid. With that said, the Oxygen Advantage book recommends all types of breath holding, and I have gotten a lot out of it. One, it really forces you to develop your exhale, to get every last bit of air, to compress your core, to squeeze that out. In the holding, okay, however you like, do a few cycles, inhale, exhale, total exhale. Lock your tongue to the top of the roof of your mouth and attempt, this isn't that easy, but attempt to sort of relax your core. And if you have, pretty decent muscle tone, you'll find that the two attachment points on that front sheath of muscle, like down to your pubic bone and up to your sternum, those will relax. Your stomach will kind of go, your gut area will go slack. You hold your breath, you time it, and as this proceeds, it's not about the seconds. Seconds is just for your own sort of recording. When I'm doing this, what I'm looking to obtain is this sense of having to urinate. Sometimes you'll get a sense of needing to take a dump because maybe you already needed to take a dump. If you have absolutely no fluids in you, it might not work. If you're kind of at a nice medium place where your bladder is not bursting, but it's also not, you didn't just empty it, that would probably be ideal. And my sense is that what's happening is this so-called suffocation response that you're becoming acquainted with, that's one of the baselines, is being triggered, kind of like with the combat shits, right? Adrenaline dumps, something's happening, your body's responding to it, and it's starting to go into its order of operations about how it's going to fight or take flight. I don't want to say that I know entirely where this goes, because I don't. However, I do know that in acquainting myself with that urge, both of those or one or the other, in relation to holding my breath, has resulted in my capacity for holding my breath expanding pretty dramatically, and also a more of a familiarity with those urges on a day-to-day basis. This is, we could go over the pieces and the elements, the fine threads of the mold. I don't know how long, but we don't have time. And but this would be one of those elements, right? You're 9 years old, you're sitting in class, and you have to ask to go to use the bathroom. And yeah, it brings up the point, the nature-nurture point. If we didn't even have bathrooms, would we really need to hold it? Would we just piss on the floor or in the dirt? Well, I don't know, but we're down this road, and this is one of these areas where, to my way of thinking, if you are acquainting yourself, becoming intimate, let's say, with the order of operations that your body goes through in response to adrenaline, fight, flight, cortisol, the whole cocktail of substances that's being dumped, well, that's to the good. So that's a quick and dirty version of that exercise. The second one that, I don't think you're going to get anywhere else, refers to this idea that human being, with a capital B, that is our experience of being, requires a kind of matrix of 3 points: past, present, and future. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. If you go through these, grammar, logic, rhetoric, this triune feature of reality is pretty important. And it's an interesting sort of mental, exercise that you can divert yourself with. However, you can also use this idea. Here again, this was alluded to in the book. You can use this idea to construct for yourself pathways out or through severe crisis. If you've ever run any distance, you've probably found yourself with adopting a kind of rhythm between inhale, exhale, and your footfalls. And there is some evidence that suggests this may not be, those rhythms. They may not be optimum for like athletic performance per se. However, I've not looked, deeply into those studies. I'm personally not concerned with anything like that. I recall as a kid playing around with these rhythms, or like in high school. You don't necessarily have to count them, but I think it's helpful. You don't necessarily have to do what I do, which is I add a type of musical component. This is probably where slave songs and marching songs and such come from. What I'm suggesting specifically with this is that as you build a breath practice, there is going to be counting. Hopefully it's to 5 most of the time. Your coherence breath, that's your bread and butter. When you're working out or driving or any other opportunity you have to use this or to try it out, you can build a rhythm with walking. I mean, that's when I do it mostly, is walking. And you can build up the rhythm consciously, as you know, with the footfalls, with the arm swings, and then you can let that go and just focus on the sensation and kind of maintain that. Long term, I just find it enjoyable. It clears my mind almost instantly, and it's yet another tool that I use to actually clear my mind. Not, focus like the stockbroker or whatever. I'm super focused and hyper productive. I think that that's just not true. I think that's largely just false. And that production happens over time. And yeah, you could probably run a lot of errands or something under that mindset. But the mindset that I'm talking about is long-term, for the long haul, leading to this final confrontation, this final, your confrontation with your mortality is ultimately, there's no need to mince words, I guess. And this exercise, we mentioned the matrix, these 3 points. As you get that rhythm going, and you've cleared your mind, this is a place where, as we mentioned in the previous episode, we don't really think. We think, and we would love it if we did think, but we actually think very little. And we worry and we perseverate, but mostly we just have various grooves or loops that, some of them are beneficial and you might not want to trash them. Some of them are totally, they're just wastes of time. And so you might want to trash them. What this exercise, I believe, has given me, and what I hope it can give you, is one, a place where you can start to observe those things with very little, hopefully you can walk and chew the gum, as they say, but you can walk and observe your thoughts, but you can walk and let them go. And eventually, I think that you can start to seed that rhythm with more intentional. Intentional is a great word to use if you want to slip into Portland and LA and New York hipster circles. You put that in your go bag and whip it out, and it will help. I'm joking. This rhythm, once you lock it in and once you take stock of a clear mind that you're going forward into the future, that you are in a moment that seems to exist forever. You don't know when the last moment ended and yet there's this propulsion, and you are aware of your own energy sustaining that propulsion, and that implies an end, which is, the past has ended. And within this tripod of, whether it's ultimate reality or just what we are given to experience, is not for me to say, but through this exercise, you know, you can, if you just want to pray, sometimes that's what I do. Other times, I will more consciously seed my intentions or hopes, or, you know, ask questions. And this is not, again, like a completely ridiculous esoteric idea if you are familiar with, which is probably where I got it. I mean, many novelists or scientists or people who have to do work with their minds have found that walking somehow opens the idea valve. Well, that's certainly true, and I believe that it also opens, you know, that valve. It might be the same valve, but maybe there are two, and one goes out and one comes in. I don't, you know, I couldn't say quite how it works, but there's something permeable there, and it's available through walking, and it's compounded through walking and breathing. And of course, walking is a really good opportunity to work the intercostal side-to-side expansion. Okay, I don't know how long this podcast will be. I hope that you have found some value. Please, the feedback at this point is sustaining the effort. So I greatly appreciate it. If you've listened this far, I hope that I have given you a few things of value. They are incredibly valuable to me. And again, they have changed the course of my life. If only they spark something in you, you know, that so that you can find the little lever, the button, what have you, that gives you the advantage, then I feel like value has been imparted, and I hope that's the case. If you can just grab this and copy mine and go with it, fantastic. Copywriting this stuff seems unlikely. All right, well, I still have not found a good way to sign off. So, and I also found out that I can't use Mark Knopfler, so I'll have to make some changes. But thank you very much. Again, if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. Take care.